the climate fair play. Before the episode, I want to start with a big thank you to everyone listening to the podcast. It's incredible to see how these environmental discussions relate to people worldwide. The Earth is one of the few things that transcends cultural boundaries. Everyone has a connection in some way to the natural world. That's also where I look to first when I want to feel inspired about our global ability to act. When it boils down to it, people are ready for action on climate change. I want to start this episode by expressing my genuine gratitude to everyone listening and share my optimism that more of us are ready for climate progress than not. My name is Cody Sanford. I'm an environmental podcaster, writer, and trained ecologist. This is the Climate Fair Play podcast, a series connecting environmental news, policy, and science with community-level solutions. This episode concentrates on another global environmental issue: wildfires. Wildfire season is becoming longer and more severe, a trend seen worldwide. Every continent faces the threat. Wildfires are so widespread they're even burning in the Arctic. There are reports of fires burning underground in winter and re-emerging at full strength in spring. As climate change progresses, this threat only grows larger. Humanity has a deep relationship with fire ecology, but people usually don't think about this until wildfire smoke takes over the sky, or worse, the fires burn down our cities. This episode concentrates on humans' relationship with fire and the present threat they pose. The second part of the episode is earmarked for how wildland firefighters put themselves in the most extreme conditions and are paid close to poverty-level wages. There are reports of these men and women putting in 1,000 hours of overtime just to make $40,000. We'll discuss the effort to support livable wages for wildland firefighters and end with what we can do to prevent the risk of wildfires from causing a severe threat in our homes and neighborhoods. If you are looking for more conversations on the current state of global wildfires, I published a discussion on the Livable Future podcast with a fire ecologist about forecasting fires in ever-changing environmental conditions. At the Livable Future podcast, you can also find a conversation with an Australian environmentalist about the Black Summer Australia had in 2019 and 2020, and what the global trends of severe wildfires mean for ecosystems that evolved around fire succession. Both these episodes are linked in the show notes. Every year, 4 million square kilometers or 1.5 million square miles are burned by fire. That's larger than India and about half the size of the United States. As I'm recording, over 38,000 fires in the US have burned almost 8 million acres this year alone. And most benefit the environment, but there is a growing trend of fires growing to an enormous size. Fires that expand over 100,000 acres are called megafires. When fires reach this point, they're incredibly tough to control, partly because they often ignite in remote, dense forests that are hard to access. Wildfires usually begin in arid conditions with plenty of dry vegetation to fuel them. It's interesting that 46% of global ecoregions are fire dependent. They rely on fire for a healthy ecosystem and ecological succession. In places like the Ponderosa pine forests in the Colorado Rockies, low-intensity fires manage underbrush and dead vegetation while promoting new growth. Many plants adapted to need fire for seed release. They require heat and smoke for germination. But when fires burn so intensely, they can destroy even the seeds that are adapted to these fire-prone ecosystems. This is the case in Australia's Black Summer, where over 44 million acres burned. The fires were so intense they wiped out seeds ready to germinate after the blaze. The loss of regeneration can shift entire ecosystems. Predicting where fires will start and how they'll spread is difficult. Lightning strikes, human activity like campfires, and downed power lines are the most common ignition sources. But we're seeing a growing trend of prolonged drought conditions that create severe wildfire seasons. In the western US, wildfire season has extended by 200 to 300% in the past decade. That's roughly 2.5 months longer compared to the fire season in the 1970s. The increase in fires is tied to climate change. Global temperatures have risen by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial levels. Areas like Australia and the Mediterranean have faced reduced rainfall, increasing the likelihood of severe wildfires. In mountain regions, earlier snowmelt reduces the water availability during the dry season, which also boosts wildfire activity. Wildfires are a massive source of carbon pollution. In 2021 alone, they pumped an estimated 1.76 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. The sudden release undermines our climate goals. Our forests turn from carbon sinks into carbon sources overnight. The resulting smoke doesn't just cloud the skies, it degrades air quality and poses serious health risks. In the US alone, exposure to wildfire smoke leads to about 20,000 premature deaths each year. If you've ever breathed this polluted air, you've probably felt it. Stinging eyes, irritated sinuses, difficulty breathing. For children, people with asthma, and pregnant women, it's especially dangerous. That's not to mention what first responders have to deal with. These conditions are becoming more common as the smoke from these massive fires travels hundreds of miles. On another note, human development keeps pushing deeper into fire-dependent ecosystems. This creates a blurred line between a city and nature, or what's called the wild-urban interface. Worldwide, the overall area burned by wildfires has actually decreased, except for the wild-urban interface. Between 2005 and 2020, the U.S. National Center of Atmospheric Research found a rise in fires by 23% in these areas. This means more people are exposed to wildfires. The 2024 CoreLogic Wildfire Risk Report warns that 2.6 million homes in the US face severe or moderate wildfire risk, mostly in California, Colorado, and Texas. Researchers found wildfires in wild urban areas grew especially large and destructive between the years 2015 and 2020, the last years of the study. Fires in these areas have burned thousands of buildings and killed hundreds of people. The Lahaina fire on Maui was the deadliest in a century in the US. 102 people died, and over 2,000 structures were destroyed. This was just last year, but we're so overwhelmed by other crises that wildfire destruction barely gets noticed. Wild urban areas remain some of the most dangerous places for people, but the rise in these massive fires creates irreversible damage to biodiversity. The Australian bushfires in 2020 are estimated to have killed or displaced 3 billion animals. The fire wiped out entire ecosystems, resulting in a loss of habitat for numerous species. These bushfires threatened the survival of 49 species, according to ecologists. As temperature rises and environmental conditions change, high elevation fires become more common. Species that depend on mountain alpine conditions are losing habitat, which exacerbates the threat of wildfires in these mountain ecosystems. I'll also note that the right kind of fires greatly benefit biodiversity for ecosystems that evolved with fire. Ecological succession is a process of ecosystem change over time due to the arrival of new species, the death of an old species, and environmental changes. Fire is a leading cause of succession, and some species of plants depend on fire to spread seeds. This new set of fauna has a chance to grow, providing habitat for diverse species that have co-evolved in these fire-prone environments. This applies to 46% of global ecoregions that are fire dependent. 36% of environments are fire sensitive, and 18% are independent. Research shows that 84% of ecological regions have degraded fire systems. This means there is the wrong kind of fire in the wrong place, like too much fire or too little fire. Fire also has a lot of regulating services to the ecosystem. The most obvious one is the reduction in extreme wildfires. The more small wildfires, the less material is available to burn in the ecosystem. Wildfires also provide pest control and even helping with water regulation. Research shows that ecosystems with forest clearings have the potential for a deeper snowpack, which melts later in the spring than dense forests. The fewer trees consuming water means the resource is now available elsewhere in the ecosystem. Fire is a tool that people traditionally and currently use to manage the land. Controlled burns are an important tool for land managers to mitigate larger fires. Fire is a natural part of many ecosystems. Still, with climate change ramping up and more people living in wild urban areas, wildfires are becoming a much bigger and more dangerous problem. And the people putting themselves in the front lines of these infernos, our wildland firefighters, are underpaid and overworked. The average base pay is $15 an hour. Firefighters are leaving their jobs for better pay and better conditions. Stay tuned to find out what's being done and what still needs to be done to support these essential workers. Next is shareable stuff. Let's talk about cheatgrass, an invasive species that's fueling wildfires in the western US. This grass grows rapidly in early spring and dies by early summer, outcompeting native plants and creating dense, highly flammable fuel. Native sagegrass ecosystems used to experience fires every 60 to about 110 years. With cheatgrass taking over these ecosystems, fires can ignite every 3 to 5 years. This creates a cycle. Fires wipe out native species, allowing cheatgrass to spread more. Wildlife like mule deer and the greater sage grouse lose their food and shelter as native plants disappear. Cheatgrass likely arrived in the late 19th century through contaminated seed grain. Removing it is expensive, especially in remote areas with limited funds. This year in Wyoming, the least populated state, the governor requested $20 million for invasive species management, but only secured $10 million for pesticide control. This aims to combat cheatgrass and help native sagebrush recover. Land managers are using targeted grazing, reseeding native species, and prescribed burns to fight the invasive species. To help stop the spread, when you're hiking in the western mountains, check your clothes and shoes for cheatgrass. They're incredibly sticky and can hitch a ride without you knowing it. I often find the seeds embedded in my socks. These seeds will remain dormant until the right growing conditions. Frankly, cheatgrass is perfectly adapted to take over fire-prone ecosystems. More awareness, working with landowners and stakeholders, as well as increased funding to manage invasive grasses, are the key ways to stop cheatgrass. Fire management is essential for creating a healthy ecosystem. Heavy involvement from land managers is often required here in the US, partially because the environmental policy overlooked fire's role in these environments for a very long time. The forests have been built up with material that would have burned in a series of small fires. This ignorance of the environmental systems has resulted in the majority of ecosystems having degraded fire systems. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, people overlook our connection to fire ecology, and we also undervalue the firefighters who are putting themselves on the front line. To start, most wildland firefighters are hired on a seasonal basis, so they aren't eligible for typical benefits you'd see at a regular job. Federal wildland firefighters' starting salary is just over $28,000 a year. To reach livable wages, they need to work overtime, meaning they're working the front lines from 14 to 21 hours. The frontline conditions include toxic wildfire smoke, extreme heat, and for some reason I think I need to reiterate the direct threat of fire. The hazard pay isn't guaranteed as it depends on what the environmental conditions are. This physically demanding job doesn't promise benefits, pays poorly, and takes a genuine toll on the body. This is a hard to fill role. In California, they use prisoner labor for fire containment and have been since the end of World War II. These working conditions contrast with those of municipal firefighters. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median wage was $52,500 in May of 2022. These full-time employees receive health care, consistent schedules, and retirement plans. In an effort to pay them more, there was a change to reclassify federal employees doing this work as wildland firefighters from forestry technicians. The effort is still working for a permanent pay increase. There was a temporary increase from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in 2021, which has a $20,000 base pay to these firefighters, but expired after 2 years. The pay increases are closer to permanent as the 2025 House and Senate spending bills included provisions for a pay increase to frontline workers. If this stays within the budget, wildland firefighters will be looking to get a significant pay raise. I'll monitor this issue and keep listeners updated on this status. Before we get to what we can do in our homes and neighborhoods to lessen the threat of severe wildfires, I just want to discuss Colorado's largest fire, Cameron Peak, and the most destructive fire, the Marshall Fire. In 2020, the Cameron Peak Fire burned over 200,000 acres in the alpine forests of northern Colorado. The fire was fueled by high winds, high temperatures, steep terrain, and dry fuels, which all made it very difficult to manage. The fire's behavior was unpredictable and lasted well into the fall. I lived in northern Colorado then and was in the shadow of the fire for months. It was hard to breathe outside. The sky lost its color, and ash fell like snow. This was the largest fire in the state, but it's far from the most destructive financially. A year after the Cameron Peak Fire, the Marshall Fire, a much smaller 1,600-acre fire, started in the grassland of the Front Range, before the Rocky Mountains. This fire burned nearly 1,000 homes. 2 humans lost their lives, and over 1,000 pets died. The fire was unpredictable. We woke up and everything was normal. By the next day, the Marshall Fire caused an estimated damage of over $2 billion. This is the opposite of the Cameron Peak Fire, which caused $132 million in damages and burned continuously for months. I remember driving down the interstate to Denver without knowing about the Marshall Fire until I saw the massive plumes of smoke blowing towards the city, and my heart just dropped. It's terrifying how fast a fire can sweep through a community. The Marshall Fire was destructive, but could have been much worse if a snowstorm didn't blow in, helping firefighters with the blaze. We are building more and more houses and cities in ecosystems that depend on fire. Wildfire season is more prolonged and intense. Wildfire conditions will increase further as we face a warming climate. It's necessary for people who live in fire-dependent ecosystems to stay on top of the aspects that they can control to mitigate the chances of creating or spreading wildfire. In the final part of the episode, we will discuss what people who live in fire-prone areas can do to help prevent the spread of fire from reaching our homes and neighborhoods. When building homes in fire-prone areas, the key is using fire-resistant materials like metal roofing, non-combustible siding, and tempered glass windows to prevent fire intrusion. If you can, seal vents to the outdoors and build patios with ignition-resistant materials. Regular maintenance, like clearing gutters, trimming vegetation, and creating space around the home without flammable material, is essential for fire safety. These steps sound repetitive, but they can significantly reduce wildfire risk to your property and improve your home's resilience in fire-prone regions. If you are visiting the Western US, please be very careful not to be the cause of a fire. Far too often, these major, destructive, deadly wildfires are caused by human activity. Thanks for tuning in. Again, it's beyond neat to see how this podcast relates to people all over the world. If you're looking for episode sources or articles on climate progress and environmental sustainability, check out climatefairplay.com. If you're on Reddit, Threads, Instagram, or Facebook, and want to join in the environmental and climate progress discussions, you can find the podcast with the social handle Climate Fair Play. All these links are in the show notes.